Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her when he thought she was out of earshot, his voice dripping down the hallway like something toxic. He didn't know she'd been standing 3 feet away, checking a monitor. He didn't know her hands had held tourniquets on arterial bleeds while rounds were incoming, or that she decomposed a tension pneumothorax in the back of a Humvee using a 14-gauge needle and nothing else. They didn't know. None of them did. Ashley Cooper moved through St. Michael's Trauma Bay like a woman who had learned that composure was a weapon, that silence was authority, and that the best soldiers never announced themselves. What happened next would change everything, but first, she had a patient to save, and a doctor who was about to realize he'd been standing next to a legend the entire time. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song overhead, that particular frequency that never let you forget you were in a place where people arrived whole and left broken, or sometimes didn't leave at all. St. Michael's Trauma Bay smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the copper edge of old blood that no amount of cleaning solution could fully erase. Ashley Cooper moved through it as if she'd been built for this exact space, her scrubs the color of faded denim, her movements economical and precise. She checked a monitor. A young attending fumbled with a central line kit, his hands moving too fast, his breathing audible in a quiet moment between crises. "You're going to nick the pleura," Ashley said. Not a question. Not even really a suggestion. A statement of fact, delivered in a voice that never rose above conversational. "Withdraw 2 centimeters. Angle steeper. You'll catch the second rib." The attending stopped. He was maybe 7 years into medicine, maybe 6. Young enough to still believe he knew things. He looked at the nurse, just the nurse, that's how he'd think of her later, and he withdrew. 2 centimeters. He angled steeper. The needle threaded into the subclavian vein like it was meant to be there. The attending's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. Ashley was already turning toward the next bed. She moved with her shoulders squared, her spine straight, the kind of posture that came from years of wearing a plate carrier instead of a stethoscope. A medical student watching from the corner of the bay, a kid named Thomas who was trying to decide if medicine was real work or just expensive babysitting, noticed how Ashley always positioned herself with her back to the wall. The kid had asked her about it once, casually, trying to sound curious instead of clinical. Ashley had said something vague about not liking surprises, and the student had dropped it, sensing a boundary he shouldn't cross. There was a scar on her left knuckle, 3 inches long, faded to white, the kind of scar that came from impact with something that wasn't yielding. Both knuckles, actually, and if you looked close, you could see similar marks on her right hand. The charge nurse, a woman named Marie who'd been at St. Michael's for 19 years, had learned not to ask. Ashley's past was a locked box, and Marie respected that. Respect was the thing that mattered at 3 in the morning when you were elbow deep in a trauma, not credentials or pedigree. "Where do you want the 18-gauge?" asked a resident, holding an angiocath needle the size of a thumbnail. "Right antecubital," Ashley said. 2 attempts max, or go femoral. The resident was competent. He was in. "First stick." Ashley had already moved on, her eyes tracking the vital sign monitor like a hunter watching for movement in tall grass, everything still, everything quiet, and then suddenly everything urgent. A monitor alarmed. "Bradycardia." A student jumped. Ashley was already there, her hand on the monitor screen, pulling up the 12-lead EKG before anyone had time to panic. "Artifact from movement," she said. Patient moved his arm. "Look at the lead too. That's noise, not a rhythm change." The student nodded, breathing out relief he didn't know he'd been holding. Ashley moved on. She kept a coffee mug in her locker, cracked ceramic, the glaze chipped around the rim, some kind of military insignia printed on the side in faded gold. Nobody asked about it. Her locker was at the back of the break room, and she was in it for about 90 seconds during a 12-hour shift, so most of the staff never even knew it was there. The mug had been broken in 2019, somewhere in the Hindu Kush, and superglued back together by someone whose hands were shaking from something that wasn't medicine-related. She'd kept it anyway. It was the kind of thing you kept. Dr. Mercer arrived for his shift at 7:41 a.m. sharp, the way he always did, his white coat already hanging on his shoulders like a cape, his stethoscope draped around his neck in the way that suggested he'd never actually used it for listening to heart so much as for being photographed. He was 43, had been married twice, had a boat in the marina that he went to maybe 4 times a year, and had absolutely no idea that the person he was about to watch through the window of Trauma Bay 2 had once rappelled into a valley at 2 in the morning to pull 6 wounded soldiers out of a firefight that was still active. He saw a nurse. That's what he saw. A soft-spoken woman who apologized when someone bumped into her in the hallway, who deferred to residents, who stayed late to chart because it was the right thing to do. He did not see the way her eyes tracked exits and entry points. He did not see the tactical awareness that made her know, without turning around, that Dr. Mercer had just entered the bay. He did not see the way her left leg was slightly stiff because of a round that had shattered the fibula in 2018, a round that should have ended her career but hadn't, because Captain Ashley Cooper had learned not to quit. Dr. Mercer watched her give instructions to a third-year resident about the proper placement of a central line, watched the resident comply immediately, watched the procedure go flawlessly. Mercer's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and began taking notes. "Who does she think she is?" he asked the charge nurse, and his voice had that texture to it, the texture of someone who'd been told once that he was the smartest person in any room and had never questioned it. "That resident should be learning from me." Marie looked at him with the specific expression that people in healthcare develop after about 7 years, the expression that meant she'd heard this kind of thing before and would hear it again, and none of it would matter. "Best trauma nurse we have," she said. "Saves at least 1 life a week that might have gone the other way." "A nurse isn't supposed to teach residents," Mercer said. "It creates confusion about scope of practice." He said it the way someone might say the sky should be a different color. Marie didn't bother responding. She'd already moved past him, charts in hand, toward a patient who needed actual medical attention. Mercer stood there for another moment, watching Ashley chart at a computer terminal with the kind of focus that suggested she'd forgotten he existed. His fingers drummed against his thigh. His mind was already moving ahead to his grand rounds, to the conversation he was going to have with the program director about nursing scope, about hierarchy, about the proper order of things. Ashley Cooper was moving through the bay like she belonged there, and that was the thing that Dr. Mercer could not tolerate, people who belonged in places where he'd decided they didn't. At 9:33 a.m., the ER doors burst open with the kind of violence that told you something was wrong before anyone had even said a word. A figure stumbled through, tall, massive, the kind of man who'd been built for carrying things. His shirt was soaked through with blood, the kind that pumped, not bled. His breathing was wrong. Too fast. Gasping. His skin had that grey-white quality that meant his body was already shutting down, diverting blood away from the extremities, away from the skin, toward the core organs that mattered. GSW to the left anterior chest, called out the paramedic, not yelling, just stating facts the way EMS does when they've seen enough trauma to understand that panic doesn't help anyone. Entry wound at the 4th intercostal space. Breath sounds diminished on the left. "We've got tension pneumothorax building. Vitals are BP 94/58 and dropping, heart rate 142, O2 sat 89 and falling." The room moved. It was what happened, the room took the information and it moved, people sliding into places they'd trained for. A trauma attending, Dr. Richardson, began rattling off orders. Mercer was already moving toward the patient, already preparing to take the lead because that's what attending physicians did. That's what the hierarchy demanded. The patient gasped again. A sound like something drowning in air. Ashley was moving. Not rushing, rushing gets people killed. Moving with purpose, moving like she'd calculated exactly where she needed to be. In her hand was a 14-gauge needle attached to a plastic catheter, the kind of thing that belonged in a subclavian line, not a decompression. She was already at the bedside, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She placed her fingers on the patient's chest wall, finding the landmarks the way someone might find her way home in the dark. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular line," she said. Not to anyone specifically. Just stating coordinates. "What are you doing?" asked Dr. Mercer, and there was confusion in his voice, the kind of confusion that came from someone who hadn't just seen what everyone else had seen, which was that the patient's oxygen saturation had fallen to 82 and was still falling, that a chest X-ray would take for minutes they didn't have, that the only thing standing between this man and cardiac arrest was the needle in Ashley's hand and the 3 years she'd spent in Helmand province learning to make decisions, with the sound of incoming rounds shaping her medical choices. Ashley didn't answer. She didn't look up. Her hand moved with that terrifying fluid precision that comes only from repetition under pressure. The needle penetrated the chest wall. There was a moment of resistance, a tactile thing that you could only learn by doing it 200 times with your heart rate above 120. Then the hiss of air escaping. The hiss of air escaping that had been crushing the patient's lung. That had been pushing his mediastinum toward his right side. That had been killing him. The patient gasped. Not from drowning anymore. From something else. From oxygen reaching his lungs again. From air pressure inside his chest equalizing. From staying alive. O2 sat climbed. 82, 88. 92, climbing. Holding. Dr. Mercer's jaw had tightened in a way that suggested he was calculating something internal, some algorithm about whether he was about to lose authority in front of every resident in the trauma bay. He was. The Army Ranger, 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle and trauma and the kind of eyes that had seen things that didn't have names yet, turned his head toward Ashley. He was breathing easier now. The compression was gone. He could feel the difference the way you can feel the difference between drowning and breathing. He stared at her hands. At the way her fingers were already moving to the next thing, the next task, never stopping, never pausing for credit or recognition. He stared at her like he was trying to place her. He said, and his voice was hoarse from the trauma, from the gasping, from the thing he'd just survived that should have killed him. "Where'd you learn to decompress like that?" The trauma bay had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a lull in action, but the quiet that comes when something important has just happened and nobody wants to miss the echo of it. Ashley turned her head. She looked at the patient. His eyes were a pale blue, the kind of blue that you only saw in people who'd spent years looking at high desert and harsh light. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in the mirror for 12 years. "Just training," she said. "Standard protocols." "No," the ranger said. His breathing was steadier now, his body already beginning to recover, already accessing reserves that shock had been blocking. "That's not protocol. That's how Captain Vance taught us in Helmand. That exact angle. That exact feel. You hunt for that moment when you can feel the needle slip through the parietal pleura, and most people can't feel it, but you." He stopped. He was looking at her like he was seeing something that had been invisible before. "You can feel it, can't you?" Ashley met his eyes. One measured breath. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her was steady except for one thing, a single tear that escaped from the corner of her left eye, tracing a path down her cheek that she didn't wipe away immediately, that she let sit there for exactly 3 seconds before her hand moved and erased it like it had never happened. She didn't answer. She turned back to her charting. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of mechanical precision that meant she'd gone somewhere else, somewhere internal, somewhere that the trauma bay couldn't reach. The ranger kept watching her, his oxygen mask now in place, his vitals stabilizing, his life no longer measured in seconds remaining but in minutes, hours, days that he was going to get to keep. He kept watching her until Dr. Mercer moved between them, positioning himself in a way that suggested he was the one who'd just saved a life, that the hierarchy had been restored, that things were back in their proper order. But the ranger wasn't looking at Dr. Mercer. He was still looking at Ashley, at the nurse who'd known exactly where to put the needle, who'd known exactly what she was doing, who'd moved like she'd done this not in controlled medical scenarios but in the red dust and mortar fire of a place where hesitation killed people. The vending machine hummed its electric drone, fluorescent light casting shadows under Mercer's eyes as he fed dollar bills into the slot. Ashley approached from the hallway, her shift ending in 7 minutes, her scrub still damp from the trauma bay cleanup. She wasn't thinking about him. That was the mistake Mercer made, assuming she ever thought about him at all. You know what I can't stand? His voice pitched deliberately loud, angled toward the intern beside him like a fisherman setting bait. These combat nurses who think they're heroes come back from their little field experience acting like it trumps a decade of medical training. Absolutely embarrassing. People who think battlefield triage makes them surgeons. He selected a diet soda, let it drop with a mechanical thunk. The arrogance is staggering. The intern's eyes darted toward Ashley. A mistake. Mercer's gaze followed. Ashley stopped at the machine's glass front. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't quicken. The muscles in her forearms, scarred along the inner wrist in patterns that looked almost surgical if you didn't know better, remained loose. She studied the chip selections like they held profound meaning, the kind of studied indifference that made officers in a desert compound wonder if she was actually listening or just waiting for them to finish talking. Then she turned. Her voice when it came was measured, quiet enough that the intern had to lean forward to hear it. Interesting theory from someone who's never held a scalpel while rounds were incoming. The words landed like a blade between ribs, not violent, just precisely placed. Mercer's face went the color of a sunset over bad news. His hand crushed the soda can, carbonation hissing out in a sound like air escaping from a wound. "Excuse me." His voice climbed 3 octaves. "Excuse me, Nurse Cooper? You need to learn your place in this hospital. One more insubordinate word out of your mouth and I will call security and have you escorted out of this building. Do you understand me?" Ashley met his eyes for 3 seconds. 4. Long enough for him to realize she wasn't afraid of security, wasn't afraid of him, wasn't afraid of anything he could threaten. Then she reached up and wiped a single tear from her left cheek without breaking eye contact, a movement so controlled, so deliberate, that it looked less like emotion and more like she was removing something inconvenient. Dust. A raindrop. The memory of someone else's blood on her hands. She walked past him toward the corridor. Didn't hurry. Didn't slow down. Just moved the way people moved when they'd spent years walking through spaces where hurrying got you killed. The intern stared at the floor tiles. Mercer stood motionless, soda dripping from his crushed can onto his Italian loafers, and for the first time since arriving at St. Michael's, Ashley Cooper watched him experience the feeling of being utterly, completely inconsequential. The next morning, Mercer's campaign entered its strategic phase. Grand rounds began at 8 a.m. in the conference room on the 3rd floor. 20 residents filed in, coffee cups steaming, some still half asleep from overnight calls. The walls were lined with backlit panels and a projector that hummed with the kind of white noise that made people's attention drift. Ashley sat in the back row because she'd learned long ago that the back was where you could move fastest if you needed to. Mercer stood at the podium in a 3-piece suit that cost more than her monthly rent, his presentation already loaded on the screen behind him. He smiled at his audience with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned, never been tested, never held responsibility for something that couldn't be fixed with a phone call to someone who owed him a favor. "Let's discuss a cautionary tale about scope of practice," he began, his voice the texture of expensive leather. The first slide appeared, a case study. No names, but the details were specific: trauma bay, needle decompression, a patient who coded and survived. The residents exchanged glances. Some of them had been there that day. Mercer clicked to the next slide. A quote from the Nursing Scope of Practice Guidelines, paragraph numbers highlighted. "Some people believe that military field experience translates to hospital protocols," he said. "That because they've worked in certain environments, they understand our hierarchies and structures here at St. Michael's. But let's be clear." His gaze didn't move toward Ashley, which made it obvious that it was meant to. A hospital is not a war zone. We have physicians for a reason. We have chain of command. We have standards. Several residents smirked. One of them, a third year with the kind of face that suggested he'd never been denied anything, actually smiled. Ashley's breathing remained steady, for counts in, for counts out, the technique she'd learned in a pre-deployment briefing that now felt like a lifetime ago. She watched Mercer the way she'd once watched insurgents across a valley, cataloguing his movements, his tells, his assumptions. Especially his assumptions. When nurses exceed their scope of practice, Mercer continued, when they perform procedures reserved for physicians, when they treat this hospital like a forward operating base instead of a medical institution, they compromise patient safety. And more importantly, they undermine the entire structure that allows medicine to function. He turned to his audience with the expression of a man explaining something simple to children. You're all going to be doctors. Remember this: authority matters. Hierarchy matters. The person with the credentials is the person who makes the decisions. The presentation lasted 18 minutes. Ashley didn't move. Didn't look away. Just sat in the back row and watched Dr. Mercer, a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered, the knowledge that he was fundamentally, irrevocably ordinary, explain to a room full of future physicians why competence alone would never be enough. When it was over, the residents filed out in clusters, their conversations already moving on to other cases, other lectures, other concerns. Mercer stayed at the podium, gathering his materials with the unhurried precision of someone savoring a victory. What he didn't know was that one of the residents, a quiet woman named Chen who'd been in the trauma bay that day, was already calling the American Nurses Association. What he didn't know was that the Army Ranger patient had written a letter of gratitude that was about to arrive at the hospital's public relations department. What he didn't know was that the next 48 hours would contain events that would make grand rounds feel like a minor inconvenience. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened on Wednesday afternoon. The hospital director's office occupied a corner of the 5th floor with windows facing east toward the historic district of Savannah, all Spanish moss and live oak trees and buildings that had stood for longer than most men's careers. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the director, was 63 years old and had been at St. Michael's long enough to know when someone was making a move on the chessboard. She'd been making moves herself since before Mercer got his first attending position. She had Ashley's personnel file open on her desk. Medical license. Clean record. 3 commendations for patient care. A note from the emergency department supervisor about her exceptional composure under pressure. Beneath that, Mercer's incident report from the day of the Ranger's arrival, claiming she'd performed procedures without physician oversight. Then a formal complaint invoking Hospital Policy 7.3.2. Then a memo to credentialing about background verification concerns. The problem was that Dr. Okonkwo had made a call to someone at Walter Reed when the first complaint came through. And that person had told her, very carefully and with very specific language, that Captain Cooper's background was not available for discussion and that any further inquiries should be directed through proper channels, and would she please ensure that the captain's personnel file remained confidential. That was enough. That was more than enough. But it was also nothing compared to the letter that had arrived that morning from the Pentagon's Inspector General office, marked urgent and requesting that any personnel actions regarding a specific employee be delayed pending an administrative review. Dr. Okonkwo knew how to read institutional warnings. She'd been reading them for 40 years. Still, the termination letter was sitting on her desk when Ashley walked in at 2:24 p.m. on Wednesday, still in her scrubs, still carrying the weight of another 12-hour shift where she'd stitched wounds and held hands and never once revealed that she knew exactly how much blood a human body could lose and still survive. "Ashley, please sit." Dr. Okonkwo gestured to the chair across from her desk. Ashley Saturday. The chair had arms made of dark oak, the kind of furniture designed to make people feel smaller. It didn't work. "I'm going to be direct with you," the director said, sliding the envelope across the mahogany surface. "Dr. Mercer has filed multiple complaints regarding your scope of practice. The hospital's legal department has reviewed them. We've also received inquiries from the credentialing committee." She paused, watching Ashley's face for any reaction. There wasn't one. Personnel actions at this hospital are never taken lightly, and in your case, there are complications. But the complaints are documented, and we have a responsibility to follow protocol. Ashley picked up the envelope. Heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that expensive things came in. Her name typed on the front, for Ms. Ashley Cooper. "I'm sorry," Dr. Okonkwo continued, and she actually sounded like she meant it. "You're a good nurse. But this is a termination letter, effective immediately. Security will help you collect your personal effects. You'll receive 2 weeks severance and continued health insurance for 90 days. The words were background noise. Ashley's attention was on the window, where the sun was beginning its descent toward the river, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere out there, her son Caleb was in high school, probably in AP history, probably not thinking about whether his mother would still have a job when she picked him up from soccer practice tonight. She stood. The letter made a soft whispering sound as she folded it in half. "Is there anything you want to say?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. "No," Ashley replied. The voice was quiet. Composed. The voice of someone who had learned a long time ago that words were just sounds, and sounds changed nothing, and the only thing that mattered was what you did next. By evening, she was standing at a bus stop in downtown Savannah, rain beginning to fall in that soft, persistent way that suggested it wasn't planning to stop anytime soon. A cardboard box balanced on her hip. Inside it, a cracked mug from her time at Fort Bragg, a dying succulent that had somehow survived 3 years on a hospital break room windowsill, and a photograph in a frame, her Ranger team, 12 soldiers in digital camouflage, lined up in the dust of Helmand province. Half of them had faces that had been carefully, methodically crossed out with black marker. Not because she wanted to forget them. Because she had to. The rain hammered down like applause nobody had asked for. Ashley shifted the box and waited for the bus, her military ID still in her pocket, her secret still locked inside her chest, and absolutely no idea that everything was about to change. The monitor screamed. A sound like a siren trapped inside a metal box. Oxygen saturation dropped through the numbers 82, 78, 72. The Army Ranger's eyes rolled back until only white showed. His chest heaved but nothing moved, nothing filled, the lungs collapsing like sails in dead air. His skin turned from sunburned pink to the color of wet concrete. Dr. Mercer's voice cracked. "Chest tube kit. Now. Move." He was already moving toward the trauma bay, but his movements looked like a man wading through water. Fear had made him clumsy. Fear had made him small. Ashley saw it the moment she looked at him. His hands trembled as he reached for the sterile field. The equipment tray rattled in his grip. He dropped the kit. The entire package scattered across the tile floor like bones, plastic clattering against the hard surface, instruments spinning in slow motion. A scalpel slid under the crash cart. Gauze pads scattered. The sterile field was compromised. Dead. Useless. Everything stopped. Not the monitors, they kept screaming. The O2 sat kept falling. But the room itself held its breath. Waiting. Ashley didn't ask for permission. She didn't raise her hand or wait to be acknowledged. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory written in scar tissue and muscle fiber and 4,847 hours of field medicine in places where mistakes meant body bags. She reached for the crash cart. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Her fingers found it without looking. The motion was automatic. Muscle and bone remembering what her mouth could never say. She approached the Ranger from his right side. Her palm found his chest wall. Fingers palpating upward, counting ribs like someone reading Braille. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. A landmark her body knew better than her own address. Better than her own name. She could find this spot in the dark. She could find this spot while rounds were incoming. She could find this spot while soldiers were screaming. The needle went in without hesitation. No fumbling. No self-doubt. No tremor in her wrist. Just precision. Just the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to a person. The hiss. That sound. The trapped air screaming out of the pleural space, the pressure that had been crushing the lung releasing like a valve opening. A small exhalation. The sound of physics saving a life. The sound of training meeting crisis and winning. The ranger gasped. Color rushed back into his face like someone had turned up the saturation on his skin. His chest expanded. His lungs filled. Real air. Real oxygen. Real blood flow. The monitor numbers climbed. 81, 87. 93, normal. Sinus rhythm. The kind of rhythm that meant survival instead of body bags and notification officers at someone's front door. Ashley secured the needle with tape. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Nothing in her showed the earthquake that had just moved through her chest when the patient's eyes opened and found hers. When he looked at her hands. When recognition flickered behind those eyes like a match being struck in the dark. Sergeant Torres. The name was on the chart, but she hadn't needed it. She had seen his type before. Army Ranger. The kind of man who got cut in bar fights and came to trauma bays bleeding but still dangerous. The kind of man who survived things. The kind of man who belonged to a unit that belonged to a place that belonged to a war that belonged to a past that was supposed to stay buried. He stared at her hands. Not her face. Her hands. As if her hands were a letter from a dead friend. As if her hands were proof of a ghost. He whispered. His voice was hoarse. The ventilator had torn at his throat. Where'd you learn to decompress like that? That's exactly how Captain Vance taught us in Helmand. Second intercostal, no hesitation, twist on entry. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Ashley's hands froze. Just for half a second. The smallest pause. The kind of pause a normal person wouldn't notice. But Sergeant Torres noticed. Soldiers always notice. They spend their careers noticing. Noticing the difference between a branch falling and a sniper. Noticing the difference between traffic noise and incoming fire. Noticing the difference between a nurse and something else entirely. She met his eyes. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. One breath where her throat tried to close and her chest tried to cave and 16 years of careful silence tried to crack open right there in front of 12 witnesses and a monitor beeping proof of life. A single tear escaped. Just one. The kind of tear that might look like the heat of the room or stress from the save. She wiped it away without breaking contact with Torres. Without flinching. Without letting the mask slip more than that 1 second. I'm going on break, she said quietly. Her voice came out flat. Professional. Like someone reading a weather report. Like someone who hadn't just been recognized by a ghost. Like someone who wasn't falling apart behind her own eyes. She returned to her charting. Her hands moved across the computer keyboard. Documenting the patient's vitals. The intervention. The response. All of it clinical. All of it true. All of it incomplete because the most important parts could never be written down. Dr. Mercer's face had turned the color of raw meat. Not red. Darker than that. The color of blood without oxygen. His jaw clenched and unclenched. His fists opened and closed. She could see the thoughts moving behind his eyes like sharks circling. Seeing the save. Seeing the technique. Seeing what he couldn't explain without admitting that a trauma nurse had performed a surgical procedure with more competence than he could manage under crisis. Everyone out, he said. His voice came out low and controlled. Which was worse than if he had shouted. Anger had rules. Control was strategic. The trauma bay cleared. Nurses and techs and residents fled like the room had caught fire. Only Ashley remained, standing at the bedside, her gloved hands resting on the patient's shoulder. Touching him like he mattered. Like he was more than a chart and a complication and a situation to be managed. Dr. Mercer waited until the last resident cleared the doors. Then he turned to face her. His presence made the air pressure change. Not through size or volume. Through the force of his certainty. The weight of his institutional authority. The crushing momentum of a man who had spent 23 years learning that his title meant he was right, and that rightness was the same as being powerful. "You just performed a surgical procedure without physician oversight," he said. Each word landed like a hammer strike. "That's a terminable offense. Hospital Policy 7.3.2, Paragraph 4, Subsection B, Nursing Scope Limitations. You're done here, Cooper. Finished. I'm calling administration right now." Ashley said nothing. She had learned long ago that words were the weakest weapon. Words could be argued with. Words could be interpreted. Silence was absolute. Silence was a wall. She removed her trauma gown. Peeled the latex gloves. Placed them in the biohazard bin. Every motion was precise. Every motion was composed. Not a tremor. Not a crack. Not a single piece of evidence that the ground had just opened beneath her feet and swallowed another 5 years of her life. She walked to the locker room. Her footsteps echoed on the tile floor. The hospital around her felt different now. Like she was already a ghost. Like she was already leaving, and everyone could sense it, the way animals sense death approaching. Dr. Mercer returned to his office at 4:16 p.m. She would find out later that he had started typing his incident report immediately. Documenting everything. Creating a paper trail that was pristine and meticulous and devastating. Citing regulations with paragraph numbers. Building a bureaucratic fortress that would make her defense impossible. Not without telling the truth. Not without saying the words that could never be said. Not without exposing classified operations and black site extraction missions and the names of soldiers who had died in the dark. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the ranger had called her by a name. Not captain. Not her rank. Her call sign. And now the hospital knew something was wrong. Now people would start asking questions. Now the carefully constructed wall between her two lives had developed a crack, and cracks in walls always led to collapse. Dr. Mercer didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office at St. Michael's with the overhead lights off, just the desk lamp casting his shadow across 3 legal pads filled with precise handwriting. His Mont Blanc pen moved with the deliberation of someone constructing a case that could not be dismantled, each point lettered, each regulation cited with paragraph numbers, each potential counter-argument already neutralized. The clock read 2:34 a.m. By the time the sun rose over Savannah, the infrastructure would be in place. By Wednesday, she would be gone. The incident report was first. He dated it 1847 hours Wednesday, backdated it to 1,200 hours to suggest he'd filed it immediately after the Trauma Bay incident, a small touch that would feel like due diligence to the credentialing committee. The language was precise, almost surgical, observed RN Ashley Cooper administering emergency needle decompression without physician order or direct supervision. Procedure performed in direct violation of hospital protocol regarding nursing scope of practice. No resident physician was present during critical airway intervention. Potential patient safety risk. He sees it risk management, the chief medical officer, the chief nursing officer, and the credentialing committee. 7 copies. Each one stamped. Each one routed through proper channels. By Thursday morning, the formal complaint was filed. This one cited Hospital Policy 7.3.2 with the precision of someone who'd memorized it: nursing personnel shall not perform invasive procedures without explicit physician authorization and documented physician presence. He added cross-references to JCAHO standards, 3 different sections, and a reference to state nursing board regulations. He included a statement that the incident had potentially compromised patient safety and suggested this was part of a pattern of scope creep. No pattern existed, but the credentialing committee would assume there was weight behind the word pattern. The word itself was heavy enough. Friday morning brought the memo. This was his masterpiece. Addressed to the credentialing committee with copies distributed to risk management, human resources, and the hospital's legal counsel, it raised questions about Ashley's background verification process. Upon reflection regarding the incident of the 14th of November, I believe we should conduct a comprehensive audit of Ms. Cooper's employment file. Her references appear vague. Military service, classified details is not specific enough for credentialing purposes. I recommend verification of her educational background and prior employment history. The hospital's exposure to liability may be significant if we have verified employment without proper documentation. The word classified was the genius move. It planted a seed of doubt. Were her credentials real, or was she hiding something? It was technically true, but Dr. Mercer knew that truth could be weaponized. He wasn't technically lying. He was just narrowing the field of vision until people saw only what he wanted them to see. The documentation trail that followed was meticulous. Each form was stamped with the hospital's official seal. Each routing slip showed which department had reviewed it. Risk management, stamped, initialed, dated 0830 hours Friday. CMO review, completed 1145 hours Friday. CNO review, completed 1400 hours Friday. The credentialing committee chairman received his memo at 1630 hours Friday, and by 2100 hours, the chairman had called the chief medical officer with instructions, initiate termination proceedings. The documentation is overwhelming. The 72-hour clock started Sunday evening. Dr. Mercer moved through St. Michael's Monday with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a complex machine operate exactly as designed. He saw the HR director reviewing Ashley's file. He saw the credentialing committee chairman making phone calls. He saw the machinery grinding forward, and he knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The bureaucratic fortress was complete, not built on truth, but built on procedure, precedent, and the institutional weight of documented regulation. It didn't matter whether what he'd written was entirely fair. It mattered that it was officially processed. Ashley understood this on Wednesday afternoon when the hospital director called her into his office. She sat across from him in a chair designed to be uncomfortably low, her knees slightly higher than her hips, a subtle power dynamic that worked on anyone who didn't know better. She knew better. She sat perfectly still. "I'm sorry, Ashley," the director said, sliding an envelope across the desk. His name was Richardson, and he'd worked in healthcare administration for 19 years, long enough to recognize institutional pressure but not long enough to question it. The documentation is overwhelming. The credentialing committee has voted unanimously. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. We're providing 2 weeks of severance and a letter of reference regarding your nursing skills, but the scope of practice issue is beyond our control. She didn't reach for the envelope. She let it sit on the desk between them for 4 seconds. "I see," she said. "If you'd like to discuss the specific concerns, our legal team can arrange a meeting. But the committee's decision is final." He slid a cardboard box across the desk next. "We've already packed your personal items from your locker." She stood, picked up the box. The weight was maybe 5 pounds. She'd been at St. Michael's for 14 months. The entire time had fit into a box that small. She could smell the cardboard and something else underneath, antiseptic from the hospital laundry, the smell of how her other life had ended. "Thank you," she said, and walked out. The rain started before she reached the parking lot. It came down hard, the kind of rain that makes people run, but she walked at a normal pace. The cardboard box began to soften immediately. She could feel it wilting against her hip. By the time she reached the bus stop at the corner of Bull and East 34th, water was seeping through the bottom. She stood under the shelter, a metal and plexiglass construction that looked like it had been designed by someone who didn't actually understand how weather worked. The bus stop bench was wet. She remained standing. A city bus splashed past without stopping. Wrong route. The next bus wasn't due for 17 minutes. She adjusted her grip on the cardboard box and looked down through the translucent bottom. She could see the shape of the mug inside, a cracked thing with a faded Ranger scroll that she'd picked up at a thrift store in Tacoma 7 years ago. Below that, the succulent she'd kept alive for 3 years, now turning brown at the edges because she'd skipped watering it yesterday. And below that, the photograph. The one she never should have kept. 18 soldiers arranged in 3 rows outside FOB Shank, June 2013. Names she no longer said aloud. Faces she'd trained herself not to see. Half of them had the word fallen written in black marker across their eyes, a way of remembering without remembering. A way of honoring without speaking the names aloud. That was the rule. The names stayed classified. The operation stayed buried. The soldiers who didn't come home stayed hidden inside the walls of a classified Pentagon file that said they had never existed at all. Captain Ashley Cooper had been erased. What was left was just a nurse, standing in the rain with a box of things that proved she had been alive once. A car horn sounded somewhere on Bull Street. Thunder rolled across Savannah like artillery, the kind of sound that made her body tense involuntarily, made her shoulders shift backward, made her hands ready for something that wasn't coming. She forced herself to breathe. Counted to 4 on the inhale. Counted to 4 on the hold. Counted to 4 on the exhale. A meditation technique that worked because it was a counting technique, not because there was anything spiritual about it. The body responded to pattern. The body responded to discipline. The body could be trained not to remember. The rain continued. The cardboard box continued to soften. She thought about Dr. Mercer and what he'd done with such clinical precision. He'd probably felt righteous about it. Probably told himself he was protecting patients, enforcing standards, maintaining hierarchy. Probably slept well that night. There was something almost admirable about his competence, she thought. The way he'd constructed a case that couldn't be defended because she couldn't reveal the truth. The way he'd leveraged bureaucracy like a weapon. He'd outmaneuvered her because she was playing by rules she'd sworn to follow, classified rules, secret rules, rules that made defense impossible. At 18:47 hours, her phone buzzed with a text from her son. Caleb was 16 and had inherited his father's height but her quiet determination. He'd texted one word, Mom. She texted back, bad day. Home soon. At 19:23 hours, she walked up the steps to the apartment. The cardboard box had begun to collapse completely. She could feel things shifting inside it, the succulent was probably crushed by now. She didn't open it to check. She set it on the kitchen table and went to her room. Caleb knocked on the door at 20:40 hours. You okay? Just a bad day, sweetheart, she said, and she closed the door against the light. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hands flat against her thighs, a grounding technique. A check-in with her own body. Still here. Still breathing. Still classified. Still alone with the information that could explain everything and destroy everyone. The rain continued outside her window. Lightning flickered across the darkness. She counted the seconds between the lightning and the thunder to calculate distance, a habit from a lifetime of calculating what was far enough away to be safe. The storm was moving closer. But she had learned to measure distance in different units now, not miles between her and the explosion, but years between her and the person she used to be. And that distance was closing. She could feel the cracks in the wall she'd built between her 2 lives. She could feel something on the other side, pressing outward, trying to get through. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for whatever would come next. Caleb Cooper pushed through the ER entrance at 7:53 a.m., still wearing his St. Andrew's prep school uniform, the shadow box clutched against his ribs like it might shatter if he breathed too hard. The cardboard was worn at the corners, the glass front smudged with dust accumulated over years of hiding. Behind him, the automatic doors wheezed shut. The day shift hadn't fully mobilized yet, nurses restocking supplies, residents reviewing charts, the morning calm before the controlled chaos began. He moved toward the triage desk where his mother would normally be charting, then remembered. She wasn't here anymore. The box felt heavier with that knowledge. He opened it anyway. Right there in the crowded ER lobby, surrounded by fluorescent glare and the beeping undercurrent of a dozen monitors, Caleb held up the shadow box so the glass caught the light. Inside, arranged on navy blue velvet with surgical precision, lay a collection of decorations that transformed everything anyone at St. Michael's thought they knew. A silver star. 2 purple hearts, their ribbons the color of wine and old blood. A bronze star with a combat V device. Beneath them, pressed flat, was a faded patch, the unit insignia from Helmand province, worn thin by sun and sweat and the weight of what it represented. The morning shift fell silent. Not the polite quiet of a busy hospital. A different silence. The kind that happens when the floor tilts beneath your feet. Sergeant Torres, the Army Ranger admitted 6 months ago with that bar fight laceration, was the first to see it. He'd returned to St. Michael's as a guest instructor for the new trauma program that hadn't existed before his mother was fired. His eyes locked on the decorations, then on the faded unit patch, and his voice came out as a whisper that somehow carried across the entire lobby, Reaper 6. 2 words. That's all it took. A Marine visiting his brother in orthopedics, visiting room 412, 3rd floor, where nobody knew him or cared about his uniform, happened to be walking past the triage desk when Caleb opened that box. He saw the silver star. He did what Marines do when they recognize that particular medal. He stopped. He approached. And when he saw the citation clipped inside the case, his voice began to shake before he even read the first line aloud. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, he read, each word deliberate, each word carrying weight. On the night of April 17, 2012, in Sanjin Valley, Helmand province, Captain Ashley Cooper coordinated the extraction of 12 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire, exposing herself repeatedly to hostile fire while providing field medical intervention that exceeded her assigned role and demonstrated extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming opposition. He stopped reading. His jaw worked. Then, extracted 12 wounded under sustained enemy fire. The words hung in the ER lobby like a prayer. A 2-star general had arrived at St. Michael's at 7:52 a.m. for a hospital foundation meeting scheduled weeks in advance, General Augustus Vaughn, Director of Special Operations Medical Command, who'd already reviewed the classified file on Captain Ashley Cooper that sat on a desk at the Pentagon. He was walking through the lobby toward the conference room when he saw the shadow box held up to the light. When he saw the unit patch, a patch issued only to personnel of a single covert task force in a single province during a single year. His stride stopped mid-step, and every muscle in his body recognized what his eyes were confirming. The general approached the shadow box slowly, the way you approach sacred ground. He looked at the medals. He read the citation Torres was still holding. And then he brought his hand up to his forehead in a salute so sharp it sounded like a gunshot. Not to Caleb. To the decorations. To the history they represented. To the woman they belonged to. Dr. Mercer shoved through the crowd 5 seconds later, his face purple, his voice a weapon he'd learned to wield through seniority and cruelty and the thin armor of institutional authority. Those credentials are falsified, he was shouting, his words tumbling over each other like something drowning. I have proof. The files in her employment record show discrepancies. She performed procedures she wasn't licensed for. She's a fraud. The general turned. General Vaughn's presence, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, his eyes the color of weathered steel, seemed to occupy more space than his physical body required. Dr. Mercer. You've made accusations. I have documentation. You do, General Vaughn said quietly. We know. The Pentagon liaison will review your evidence. He gestured to a man in a charcoal suit who'd followed him through the doors, someone whose eyes held the specific exhaustion of people who worked in secure facilities. Beginning immediately. The liaison made a single phone call. 2 minutes later, his phone buzzed. He listened. He hung up and looked at Mercer with the kind of professional disinterest that comes from knowing you're delivering consequences, not justice. The FBI was already en route to St. Michael's investigating medical fraud in your department. We're redirecting them to your office. The thing that happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. 6 minutes after the liaison made that phone call, 2 FBI agents arrived, their badges catching the light as they moved through the ER with the focused purpose of people accustomed to walking through doors where they weren't welcome. They found Dr. Mercer in his office on the second floor, frantically opening filing cabinets, his hands moving with the jerky precision of panic. "Look at this," he was saying, spreading papers across his desk like evidence in a desperate trial. "Cooper background audit, see? Discrepancies in her employment dates, references that don't check out, a DD 214 that shows inconsistencies. She's the fraud, not me." The first FBI agent picked up a document, examined it, looked at the metadata embedded in the digital file. His eyes moved to his partner. No words were necessary. They already knew. "Dr. Mercer, this document was created on your computer 4 days ago," the agent said, his voice clinical, the tone you use when presenting data that renders argument irrelevant. "The digital signature shows it was never part of her original file. You created it after her termination." Mercer's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. "No. I was compiling evidence. It was already there. I was just—" The second agent was already at the computer, fingers moving across the keyboard, running a forensic scan that would pull every deletion, every timestamp, every ghost of every document Mercer had ever created in anger or fear or the kind of righteousness that comes from being absolutely certain you're right. The scan took 90 seconds. "You accessed the hospital's credentialing database using an administrator password that wasn't issued to you," the agent said, reading from the screen. "You created false employment verification documents. You fabricated inconsistencies in her military discharge papers. You inserted all of it into her personnel file, dated them retroactively, and used the fraudulent documents to justify termination paperwork filed to the state board." He paused. "That's computer fraud. That's falsifying medical records. That's," he looked at his partner, "career-ending." The hospital director arrived, summoned by security, her face arranged in the specific expression of someone who'd just realized the disaster brewing in her own building. "Dr. Mercer, you're suspended immediately pending investigation." But Mercer wasn't finished destroying himself. His voice rose to a shout, raw and animal. "She's a fraud. A soldier playing nurse. She performed surgery without authorization. She took control of a trauma case when she had no right." He was pointing toward the door, toward the lobby, toward the place where witnesses had gathered. "I was protecting this hospital. I was protecting patients." General Vaughn stepped into the office doorway. His presence made the air pressure change. When he spoke, his voice carried the specific weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without argument. "Captain Cooper holds a combat medical designation that exceeds civilian paramedic certification," the general said. "She completed 3 rotations of tactical combat casualty care instruction under the 160th SAW Medical Command. Her credentials are beyond question. Yours, however, are now under federal investigation." The FBI agent produced handcuffs. They weren't theatrical. They weren't meant to humiliate. They were simply the mechanical conclusion to the narrative Mercer had written himself. Click! Click! The sound of metal closing on flesh. The sound of consequences. "Dr. Marcus Mercer, you're under arrest for falsification of federal medical records and computer fraud," the agent said, reading from a card. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They led him through the ER, down the stairs, past the triage desk, past the residents who'd watched him humiliate the nurses on grand rounds, past the nurses who'd heard him call them inadequate. Past Sergeant Torres, who watched without expression. Past the Marine still holding the Silver Star citation. Ashley stood beside the triage desk, her face neutral, breathing slowly, and when Mercer's eyes met hers for one final moment, he understood what he'd failed to calculate. She had never been trying to hurt him. She'd simply been trying to save lives. The difference was everything. 6 months later, the Trauma Training Center opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony at St. Michael's, a facility designed from the ground up to teach combat casualty care to civilian medical personnel. Ashley Cooper stood at the podium in her nurse supervisor uniform, the faded unit patch from her Helmand jacket framed on the wall behind her, finally allowed to teach the skills she'd earned in blood. Sergeant Torres stood beside the podium as a guest instructor. Residents and nurses gathered, notebooks in hand, ready to learn from someone who'd actually done this work when the stakes involved people screaming and blood and the absolute certainty that your hands were the only thing standing between someone and death. Combat casualty care follows 3 principles, Ashley said, her voice steady, her command of the room complete, not deferential anymore, not negotiating for space. Speed. Efficiency. Survival. Everything else is secondary. She paused. Today, you'll learn needle decompression for tension pneumothorax, tourniquet placement at the groin, and hemorrhage control using techniques validated in 347 combat operations across 2 decades. A resident raised her hand. Where did you learn this? Ashley met her eyes. Where it matters. In places where the textbook isn't enough. Where your hands become the difference between someone going home and someone coming home in a flag-draped box. That evening, someone mentioned Dr. Mercer's current employment to one of the residents, a casual comment about seeing his name on a community college directory. The resident pulled it up on her phone. Marcus Mercer, CPR instructor, Savannah Community College, $16.50 per hour, no medical privileges, no hospital affiliation. His name permanently flagged in the National Practitioner Data Bank with a notation that read suspended indefinitely, computer fraud and falsification of medical records. The federal charges had resulted in 3 years probation, a permanent ban from hospital employment, and a revoked medical license. Ashley looked at the screen for 3 seconds, then returned to her lecture notes without comment. That night, Caleb asked if she was glad Mercer had gotten caught. She considered the question with the same deliberate precision she applied to every decision, the composure of someone accustomed to weighing consequences. I'm glad the truth came out, she said finally. The rest is just consequences. She opened the shadow box on her desk. She kept it in her office now, displayed openly, a museum of everything she'd survived. Her fingers traced the outline of the silver star, a gesture so small it barely registered as movement. Outside her window, an Army National Guard recruiter had set up a table in the hospital lobby for a veteran hiring fair. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've made it this far, you've seen what happens when competence meets integrity. Subscribe for more stories of the hidden heroes walking among us. Like this video. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to?